So picture this. Two global superpowers, standing face to face, each with their finger hovering over a button that could literally end the world as we know it. Now, this isn't a movie plot. For decades, this was reality. Today, we're going to break down the story of the Cold War, a conflict that was fought in the shadows but ended up shaping, well, just about everything.
And you can't talk about the Cold War without this quote. These are the famous words from Winston Churchill that really gave the whole era its most powerful image. See, back in 1946, he wasn't talking about a real physical wall, he was describing an invisible one. This stark, new dividing line between the democracies in the West and the communist countries in the East that were falling under the Soviet Union's control.
So, how did we even get to this point? To understand the standoff, you actually have to go back to the very end of World War II. You've got the big three, the US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. They just defeated a common enemy, but their ideas for what Europe should look like next, they were worlds apart.
And the conflict really kicked off with a broken promise. The agreement seemed pretty clear. Let the nations of Eastern Europe hold free elections. Let them decide their own future. But Joseph Stalin, he had very different plans. He was terrified of another invasion from the West, so he wanted a buffer zone of friendly countries, and his solution was to install communist governments all across the region, creating what became known as the Soviet bloc.
And you can see this whole ideological fight perfectly in what happened to Germany itself. The Western allies, they wanted to rebuild a stable democracy. The Soviets, on the other hand, wanted to keep Germany weak. So, what was the result? Two completely separate countries, a democratic West Germany and a communist East Germany. And let me tell you, that became a major flashpoint for tension for decades.
So this informal split, it didn't stay informal for long. It quickly hardened into official policy, a policy that would basically run the world for the next 40-plus years. The lines were being drawn, and each side started building up its defenses.
The American response to all this Soviet expansion? It was pretty swift and really decisive. President Harry Truman came out and announced a new doctrine that would set the rules for this global chess match. The idea was simple. The United States would oppose the spread of communism wherever it threatened to pop up.
And this all boiled down to one key policy: containment. Now, the goal wasn't necessarily to go in and defeat communism where it already was. Nope. The plan was to build a firewall. The U.S. would use all its economic and military power to help any nation that was fighting off a communist takeover.
And they didn't have to wait long to test this new policy out. A brutal civil war was raging in Greece between anti-communist and communist forces. Great Britain had been helping the anti-communists, but they just couldn't afford it anymore. So the U.S. stepped in with a ton of aid. And what happened? The anti-communists won. Containment had just scored its first victory.
Okay, so a direct, hot war between the US and the USSR was pretty much off the table, right? I mean, the risk of nuclear annihilation was just too high, so the superpowers had to get creative. They started fighting on a whole bunch of other fronts. This was a war of words, of secrets, and of some seriously scary technology.
First step, you had the war for hearts and minds. The West was beaming messages about freedom and democracy behind the Iron Curtain, with radio stations like Radio Free Europe. Meanwhile, the Soviets were pumping out propaganda that hammered on things like racial inequality in America to show how corrupt capitalism was. You know, both sides got really good at pointing out the other's flaws.
And then, of course, you had the war in the shadows. This was the golden age of the spy. You had these incredibly powerful, secretive agencies like America's CIA, Britain's SIS, and the Soviet Union's KGB, all tangled up in this constant, secret battle of espionage and covert ops all around the globe. But hanging over every single part of this conflict was the terrifying reality of the nuclear arms race. And this led to a military doctrine with, honestly, the most fittingly insane acronym ever, MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. The logic was as simple as it was horrifying. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would fire back, and both countries would be completely wiped off the map. It was this bizarre, fragile peace built on the threat of total annihilation.
And just when you thought things couldn't get any scarier, they did. After both sides got atomic bombs, the race was on for something even bigger, the hydrogen bomb. And the leap in destructive power was just staggering. We're talking over 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The stakes of the Cold War had just been raised into the stratosphere.
So because of that threat, that whole mutual assured destruction thing, the superpowers couldn't risk fighting each other directly. So what did they do? They used other countries' conflicts as their own personal battlegrounds. And this right here is where the Cold War got devastatingly hot.
You saw it in Korea,
whereas Soviet-backed North invaded the US-backed South, which ended in a brutal stalemate that divides that peninsula to this very day. Then there was Vietnam, where America went in directly to try and stop a communist takeover, leading to a long, tragic, and devastating war. And in Afghanistan, the US armed the local opposition fighters to basically bleed the invading Soviet army dry.
So you have this constant struggle, right? Fought through propaganda, spies, and these brutal proxy wars from Latin America to the Middle East. It created this permanent state of global tension that just went on and on for over 40 years, and it cost millions of lives and completely destabilized entire parts of the world.
And the consequences of these actions were just immense. When the U.S. funneled, and I'm quoting here, a metric buttload of weaponry to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, it definitely helped bog down the Soviet Union in a debilitating quagmire. But it also armed groups that would go on to shape that region for decades, proving that the things that happened in the Cold War had these long and often totally unforeseen consequences. So, while the superpowers thankfully never fired missiles at each other, the Cold War was anything but cold for most of the world. It was a conflict fought in other people's countries with other people's lives. And that really leaves us with a final question to chew on. The world may have avoided a nuclear Armageddon, but what was the real human cost?